Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me today on Exploring Reality as we go through the rational side of the Christian faith and teaching you how to share it. Today, we're doing another response video to Matt Dillahunty and Paulogia. All right, guys, what's going on? For the audience that doesn't know you guys, why don't you just introduce yourselves real quick? Because we have some really cool people here. Tim, why don't you start?
Sweet. All right. Well, first, thanks for having me on with this. This is gonna be really fun. Yeah, Tim from Invoking Theism. That's my channel. That is my social media handle as well. You can find me on there. Really active on Twitter. Kind of less active lately, but if you want to see my kind of week-to-week thoughts, that's where I'll be. But yeah, I kind of my channel and what I do specializes around philosophy of religion, philosophy of science, metaphysics, and so just trying to kind of bridge the nuances into those more complex topics. Right now, I'm currently working on a video, semi-comprehensive, on the evidential status of evolution on grand theories. I'm going to call it something different because that's not really going to attract a lot of attention. But that's what I'm working on right now, and other things. So I'll leave it at that.
Cool. Thanks, man. And I'll be sure to link all your stuff, like your YouTube channel and anything else you want, in the description. Guarded, I guess I won't say your name. Like, I don't know if you want it to be known to people, so why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah. No, my name is Esteban. I'm the host of Guarded Acumen, which is an online channel dedicated to discussing topics in analytic philosophy, though I don't have too much content published. You can find me on channels like Discord, and you can find me on Twitter and Facebook. I focus primarily on philosophy of time, philosophy of religion, and I touch a little bit on philosophy of science. But apart from that, I'm just glad to be here with you.
Cool. All right, Aish, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm Aish. I run a TikTok account called Apologist Aish. I do focus on philosophy of religion. I've recently been interested in analytic philosophy, especially studying kind of modality. And I'm really excited to be here. So
Awesome. All right, guys. So I'll pull up the clip here. And then do you guys have any timestamps in mind? Because this is a 36-minute video. I don't know if we're going to get through the whole entire thing. Like the whole beginning part of it, to me, it just seemed like there's not much stuff that we should be covering, unless anybody has any objections to that.
I think we're going to get a good idea of what it is that Paulogia and Matt Dillahunty want to say in the first around 5 to 10 minutes of the video.
Okay.
So I think once we just get to there, like to that point, I think we'll have enough stuff to work with to gather up like responses.
So I'm just going to play like the beginning of the clip then, so that way we can kind of have at least for the audience, if they haven't seen this, a good idea of what we're responding to here. And just let me know when you guys want me to stop.
Bill, we've been hearing a whole lot about Matt Dillahunty, probably because he is the most popular atheist popularizer out there these days.
Have you been hearing a whole lot about this, Matt Dillahunty?
I had to listen to myself talk when I recorded it.
That is a lot. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians, along with today's special guest, Matt Dillahunty. So a few months ago, Matt, you recorded a video on your Atheist Debates channel called The End of the Kalam Cosmological Argument.
Yes.
Now, you didn't call it The Death of the Kalam Cosmological Argument, but it did make me think of the scene in Monty Python's Quest for the Holy Grail, where the person calls out, "Bring out your dead!" and the cart rolls by and someone on the cart. And in this case, that's William Lane Craig saying, "I'm not dead." Yeah. He says he's not dead. Yes, he is. I'm not.
That is a funny way to do it. I think this is probably the closest to a proper clickbait title I've put on any video ever, because that's just really not an interest of mine. But it was important because it's like, oh, the end of the Kalam cosmological argument. And if you listen to, like, even in the opening remarks and in the closing remarks, I point out how it isn't dead. It just should be. Well, it should have been dead from the beginning as an argument for the existence of God.
Shortly after you recorded that, you caught the attention of William Lane Craig, the primary proponent of the Kalam cosmological argument, and he decided that on his podcast that he needed to rebut what you said. And I know that not a lot of people listen to his podcast, but he is the primary thinker in this category. So I thought I would belabor this death a little bit further and have you come discuss it with me.
Yeah, it's really strange. I don't listen to Craig's podcast, and I don't even know anybody who does. And so you were the only person, and this has been months now that this happened. You are the only person that came to me and said, "Hey, William Lane Craig responded to you. What do you got to say?" Can I have friends who follow what Craig has to say and everything else? Evidently, they figured it wasn't a big deal. For the record, Craig's been invited to debate me many times, including by Christian pastors who consider him a friend and were really surprised that he refused. And he used to refuse because I don't have a terminal degree in a relevant field. And when I pointed out that this was a problematic reason to refuse anything, as if we were going to debate humanism, there's not a terminal degree, although you could probably consider philosophy degrees. But it's also a rule he had ignored for plenty of other debates. And so he changed this rule to saying that he doesn't like to debate atheist popularizers rather than academics, a rule that he's also been flexible with for others. Now, I have no interest in debating Craig. If it happens, it happens. I doubt it will. But this whole using popularizer thing as a dismissal is incredibly amusing. And I know it's going to come up later about who actually is the popularizer here.
Perfect. Well, let's dive right in and see what they have to say, starting with some incredibly loud music.
Yes, he claims that the Kalam cosmological argument has now been pronounced dead. And I just want to alert our listeners to the fact that when a popular critic says that an argument which has been debated for centuries by some of the greatest intellectuals in Western world history, and which is still a matter of debate and is defended by prominent philosophers and physicists today, when somebody says it's dead, that it's come to an end, you can be pretty much assured that he's just bloviating or that he doesn't really understand the argument. The fact is, this argument is going to continue to be discussed long after you and I and Matt Dillahunty have passed off the scene.
Yeah, it's funny. I agree. The argument is going to be discussed for a long time after we're off the scene. What I was saying was that it should stop being used specifically as an argument for the existence of God, because that's not what it is. And the next clip where they continue on the podcast clearly states this, and then Craig agrees with it and says that he's been saying the same thing for years. So Craig may have gone into this cold, I suspect, that he hadn't heard the clips, which means he's thinking on the fly. And while some of us are good at that, we'll see how this goes. You have everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has cause. It's an undeniably valid syllogism. So why am I saying the Kalam is dead? What's the end of the Kalam? Well, it should have been dead from the beginning as an argument for the existence of God. Because what is also undeniable about the Kalam is that it never mentions God. Not the word and not the concept, though some people would like to weasel that concept in.
The funny thing about that is that that's exactly what I've said, that this is an argument which proves that there is a personal creator of the universe that has many of the properties of God.
So because my claim is undeniable, Craig notes that he said, quote, exactly what I've said, but then without missing a beat, he immediately follows this up by claiming the argument proves a personal creator with many of the properties of God. This is the dishonesty that I'm actually objecting to in the video. The Kalam, as stated, doesn't mention God in the premises or the conclusion, something Craig agrees with. It also doesn't mention that the cause must be personal, and yet Craig injects right away that this proves a personal creator. It doesn't argue for any qualities of that cause, which Craig dishonestly labels a creator. It just doesn't. This is something that Craig and others do with separate arguments, and that's fine. Present those arguments, present your reasons for why you think the cause that you've determined with Kalam is personal and has the qualities. But you can go to William Lane Craig's Wikipedia page. The Kalam cosmological argument is sitting there like it is presented when he does it in debates, with two premises and a conclusion, structured argument, and then follow it up there in a couple sentences. And this leads us to conclude that it's a personal, timeless, placeless, blah, 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 and that sounds a lot like God. That's the dishonesty that I'm actually objecting to. So for Craig to acknowledge that he said exactly the same thing and then immediately inject that dishonesty, I mean, this is why I did the video. So thanks, Bill.
But if you don't want to call this being God, that's just fine with me. That has no effect upon the soundness of the argument.
Well, I didn't claim that it did have an effect on the soundness of the argument. So it's weird for Craig to seem to throw out an implication that I was wrong at another point. He hasn't shown I was wrong at any point. He's done nothing but agree with me and then shift the focus to other assertions. To say that this has no effect on the soundness of the argument, I agree and never said otherwise. So why are you bringing it up as if I did something else wrong? Now, I'm not necessarily convinced of the soundness of the early premises, but let's grant that. Let's just say that, yep, if something begins to exist, it has a cause, and the universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause.
What's very significant about this clip is that he actually grants the truth of the premises for the sake of argument. So the argument as such isn't dead at all. He's quite willing to grant that it's sound.
I'm really baffled sometimes because Craig here, instead of starting off by showing where I'm wrong, decides to discuss something else entirely. He thinks that granting the premises for the sake of argument, something that I say, and something that he repeats, is equivalent to me being willing to grant that the argument is sound. He said, what's significant about this clip is that he actually grants the truth of the premises for the sake of argument. So the argument as such isn't dead at all. He's quite willing to grant that it's sound. No, sir, I'm sorry this is confusing for you, but me granting the argument for the sake of the argument is not me concluding that it's sound. Does Craig really not comprehend the difference between I accept that this argument is sound and I'm willing to grant the entirety of this argument for the larger discussion because even if true, it doesn't achieve the goal of proving a God. If Craig's confused about that, he's not qualified to be reviewing this or anything else. What do we know about the cause of the universe? Assuming that the cause exists, what do we know about it? I don't know. I don't have any way to investigate it. Oh, well, we can definitely know that the universe isn't the cause of itself. Well, I'm not convinced that we can definitely know that because causality is necessarily temporal, and temporal causality breaks down at t equals 0, which would be the origin of the universe.
But his complaint is that there's no way to investigate the nature of the first cause. And what man fails to realize is that the arguments that I present in support of the two premises, which he's been willing to grant, have certain implications for the nature of the first cause.
So my next sin is that in critiquing the Kalam that I presented, I failed to consider Craig's other arguments in favor of the premises. I guess I should have done a video that says all of Craig's other arguments are dead. Welcome to the end of all of William Lane Craig's arguments, but I didn't. I posted one about the Kalam. I was reviewing this particular argument, which I presented, which is frequently presented by callers to the various shows I host. I wasn't claiming to be responding to Craig's entire life work or anything else. The rest of his comment in this clip suggests that it's possible to investigate the nature of the first cause, which, by the way, assumes there was a first cause, something he's fond of doing, which I'm not convinced.
Guarded.
Yeah.
Do you think that was enough of an introduction?
I think we've received the thrust of really of Dillahunty's contention, though there is much more to be concerned with later. I think at this point we could probably start a discussion on what it is that we think about what he said so far. There's a lot to say, but I'll just pitch it back to you.
Yeah, I mean, so like we just kind of finished off with him saying it's impossible to explore what the first cause could have been of the universe if we grant the sake of the premise. Like, what do you think of that? That's I have thoughts about that, but I guess Tim, Aish, Esteban, what do you guys think?
Okay, so first, it makes me really, it frustrates me when he keeps saying it doesn't argue for, what is it? I don't even know what that even is supposed to mean, that an argument doesn't argue for it. Like that to me is a really weird way to put things, because like you have syllogisms, and then the person putting forth the syllogisms then articulates and explicates like the truth of the premises within the syllogism, right? Like he says that the Kalam, like the three steps, doesn't argue for X. But like that's never the case in any argument. Like in any syllogism that puts forth, like it just doesn't self-argue. Like it's just weird to say that. And then when he went to the Wikipedia page, it's like, so like you didn't want to go to like the Stanford Encyclopedia entry and look at the, the information, being covered there on that, because it does cover it. Those are my two, I guess, issues with some, I guess, sloppiness when it comes to dealing with the argument. And then, sorry, what'd you mention? You mentioned the
how he said it's impossible to investigate what the first cause might be.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, to me, that's just, given that, especially in this, later on in the video, he says that he's like into philosophy. Well, he's going to obviously be aware of metaphysics. I just don't see why, I don't know. He says it in such a strange way, because it's like, well, we can obviously investigate these things, right? That term's very vague when it's usually used, but like we can do it through metaphysics, like metaphysically investigate these things, right? Now I know what he means. He's going to say through physics, right? That physics is going to uncover some entity, right? Some furniture out in some spatiotemporal region or something like that. And that's going to be like the thing. But he's completely downplaying the role that metaphysics has here in our theorizing or in our investigation. So
there is one thing I did notice that I think I want to point out that's important for later is Matt openly just kind of says that Craig is the foremost writer on this argument. And I think that's going to be really important to note later on when we come across certain things Matt's going to be saying. But I'll kind of just leave it there for now. Aish, Esteban?
Yeah, so I do have several things to make note of. And I'm not sure if you're okay with me doing this right now, but I could share, as I noted earlier, a four-slide PowerPoint that will just sort of give us a brief on the Kalam. And I think by having this laid out, we're going to see what has gone wrong with Dillahunty's presentation of the Kalam. So I'll just pull that up for you right now. But
there you go, sir.
Cool. Can you see that?
Yep.
Awesome. So I think it is worth noting from the beginning that the Kalam cosmological argument, it argues for three theses in particular. It argues for one, that the universe is temporally finite in the past. Two, it's going to argue that there's an external efficient cause of the universe. And then lastly, that the cause is a divine cause, namely God. And the argument has its history going back to a philosopher by the name of John Philoponus, and then later in the Kalam movement. You can find it in the medieval scholars such as Al-Ghazali and whatnot. Craig addresses this in his 1979 book from the Kalam. But it's a member of it's a member of a family of arguments, cosmological arguments, and all of these have a very similar structure, right? They each begin with some kind of a premise, maintaining that something of a certain type exists. For instance, they're going to say that there are cause things, there are contingent things, there are things that could fail to exist, whatnot. And they're going to proceed via some other principle, maybe a causal principle, a principle of explanation, the PSR, whatnot, that something of a very different type exists, right? And so we have this sort of schema here for cosmological arguments. By the way, this all comes from a chapter that Rasmussen co-authored with a philosopher by the name of Gerrit de Weese. It's called Hume and the Cosmological Argument.
Mm-hmm.
And this is effectively what we can call the first stage of every cosmological argument, right? The second stage is going to argue for something like this, right? That there is some other property that could only ever be exemplified by divine being, and that's going to be God. Now, obviously, whether or not such an inference is justified is a matter of discussion, but the Kalam does, in fact, have these two conditions. If we look here, Jerome Gelman in his paper, Prospects for a Sound Stage 3 of Cosmological Arguments, he notes that cosmological arguments will contain sub-arguments for each of these following points, namely that there's at least one necessary being, or a first cause, or whatever, and then that there can be no more than at least one necessary being, and that it has the properties such as all these great making properties we can just summarize.
Mm-hmm.
And the Kalam does in fact have this. In fact, if you read Wes Morrison's paper, Must the Beginning of the Universe Have a Personal Cause, he reconstructs Craig's second stage of the argument. Now, whether it's faithful to Craig's presentation is, again, a matter of discussion. Furthermore, if you look at the 1979 book that Craig published, he does offer, or rather he abides by the old Islamic principle of determination, which is supposed to get you to a personal cause. And he calls it the argument against a quiescent universe. And he's also published on that in this paper here, where he's responding to Stuart Gertz. So it's demonstrably false to say that the Kalam is not an argument for theism. It most certainly is. While Dillahunty may only be familiar with the first stage of the argument, either he is not familiar with the academic work, including the 1979 book and the greater discussion which preceded it, or he is being misleading and suggesting that the first stage is the only argument which is being presented, which is not.
Okay, so if I can just add, like, I totally
Yeah.
agree with everything Esteban said. And I think that what I've generally seen from Kalam is, or just any cosmological argument in general, is that you do need to have a lot of substantiation and further arguments that you make in order to make the case for, monotheism, for example. But that doesn't mean that that's not something that you can do. And I don't think there is a single person who uses the Kalam and uses cosmological arguments and then just leaves it there and claims that's proof for monotheism. I think that's disingenuous. And it's really interesting because the points that Dillahunty made so far are points that I made as an agnostic like months ago. And I just find it very almost disingenuous to say that if you've read the academic work on the Kalam, if you've done research into the Kalam, that you would believe that it's such a flimsy argument.
Yeah, I think we've hit a lot of points so far, and I think we're just gonna have a lot more to say as this continues on. The big thing really is the one I do really want to bring up is kind of like just expanding off what you said, Aish, is what is Matt expecting here? Is he expecting people to come to him with like a 48 like premise syllogism to say like that God has to exist? But the other side is like within the Kalam style like family of arguments, we also do have philosophers who do formulate the argument where God is in the premises, right? Like we have Jacobus Erasmus who does this, and so it's just it. If somebody like Matt Dillahunty wants to go out and say like this doesn't argue for theism, um, when clearly there's so much work out there, more than just Craig's, right? To that kind of just works as a counterexample to his claim. I'm just kind of curious as to why he's so ardent about this point. I guess I'll just leave it
Also,
there.
just to just a point I noticed was also that he brought up the idea that causality and temporality are completely linked. And I mean, as far as my understanding of the literature goes, like that's not something that is just like you can't leave that claim undefended necessarily, because there have been arguments regarding that. So, I mean, just for him to mention that as something that's just an assumption is interesting.
All right, you guys ready to keep going? Should I
Yeah.
fast forward a little bit anywhere, or
I think we can keep going with the natural progression of the video.
okay?
And stuff, and as a rebuttal to something that I didn't say. I didn't claim that it was impossible for anyone to investigate the cause. I noted my own limitations, something Craig doesn't seem to recognize in himself, as he's been corrected live in debate with Sean Carroll, an actual physicist.
Where Dr. Craig says that the Borda-Guth-Vilenkin theorem implies the universe had a beginning, that is false. That is not what it says. What it says is that our ability to describe the universe classically, that is to say not including the effects of quantum mechanics, gives out. That may be because there's a beginning, or it may be because the universe is eternal.
And with a note from Alan Guth in that debate.
One of the authors of the Borda-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, Alan, what do you say? He says, I don't know whether the universe had a beginning. I suspect the universe didn't have a beginning. It's very likely eternal, but nobody knows. Now, how in the world can the author of the Borda-Guth-Vilenkin theorem say the universe is probably eternal for the reasons I've already told you? The theorem is only about classical descriptions of the universe, not about the universe itself.
And by both Alan Guth and Alex Vilenkin, two of the creators of the Borda-Guth-Vilenkin model.
So that means that inflation must have had a beginning. It doesn't really say that the universe must have had a beginning.
The theorem proves that inflation must have a beginning, right? The universe as a whole, the theorem doesn't say that.
That Craig continues to misrepresent. The difference between Craig and myself here is that I'm not willing to pretend that I know more about physics and quantum mechanics than the quantum physicists do.
Well, that's your mistake right there.
But also we're sloppy with language, because if everything that is in our local presentation of the universe existed as essentially a singularity and it expanded, then what you're talking about is not the cause of the universe, but the cause of the expansion of the universe. And I don't know what would or could cause that. And I don't know that anybody else does either. And yet they will argue on behalf of a God.
He argues here, Kevin, that the argument.
All right, Tim, what do you got?
Okay, so this one right here is probably the most overstated and overblown objection to Craig in this, and it misses a lot of the nuances in physics. So I just wanted I just can't let that pass for a second. So
Yeah, go ahead.
what's interesting about that is Craig is fully aware that the BGV theorem does not apply to quantum mechanics at all. It doesn't apply to any pre-inflationary state of the universe at all. Like, yes, we understand that. That's not at all controversial. And that's the problem, especially with Carroll overstating it as well.
Mm-hmm.
That their job as physicists is to investigate the pre-inflationary era. I don't know like what you're supposed to expect of them to just like kind of pack their bags and go home at that point. But just like it's speculative, like it's all conjectural and speculative about what the nature of the pre-inflationary era is. Either there is a bounce scenario or a crunch scenario or something, and that there is some pre-existing space-time manifold going out in the other direction. That is possible, but it's not at all been shown. It's been only shown mathematically and theoretically, but it hasn't at all. There is no verification of that at all yet. Because we lack something very important, a theory of quantum gravity, right? Mm-hmm. Carroll thinks that it's going to be eternal. That's his conjecture and that's his speculation. But all we have so far, given our lack of quantum gravity, is what we understand about classical space-time. And so what Craig's really saying is that given classical space-time, given the classical regime, there is a beginning. Like there has to be, right? And what Craig is arguing, he doesn't just stop there, but what Craig thinks, he thinks that the most plausible scenario here is that even if there is some pre-existing space-time region at the pre-inflationary era, he thinks that itself is going to be temporally finite. So even if the physics discovers that there is some further stuff over in this direction, Craig is going to think on the basis of considerations such as like philosophical arguments and whatnot, that it's just going to be temporally finite. But I think that this whole idea of bring up the idea that the Borg-Guth-Vilenkin theorem doesn't really show that the universe doesn't have a absolute beginning, relies on speculative and conjectural physics based on a lack of a theory of quantum gravity. So I think that they need to be much more modest with their assumptions.
Yeah, there is a bit more to add just to kind of supplement what Tim said. So, if there's anyone who wants to have an overview of the physics relevant to the Kalam argument, I would suggest to everyone to pick up the 1993 copy, or book rather, pick up a copy of the 1993 book that was co-authored by Quinn and Smith and Craig called Theism, Atheism, and Big Bang Cosmology. I'm pretty sure you can get like a relatively cheap copy on Amazon, but there Craig does outline what it is that he means by really what he adopts as his favorite model or cosmologic model. Furthermore, you can also look at a chapter contribution to the book Naturalism, a critical analysis that Craig writes. It's called Naturalism and Cosmology. And there he goes into depth about, again, his favorite view, or his favored view, rather, for explaining, or his favorite cosmological hypothesis. But it is worth noting, though, to again add on Tim's comments, that yes, the BGV, it establishes that classical space-time under a very general condition it cannot be extended infinitely into the past, right? It's going to reach some boundary. And whether or not there is some quantity gravity region beyond that, right? If there is, right, and it's turning out to be pretty likely that there is, then even Vilenkin says that then will be the beginning, right? In a personal correspondence that he had with Craig, he said that if all past directed geodesics encounter a quantum space-time region where the notions of time and causality no longer apply, I would characterize such a region as the beginning of the universe. Vilenkin has his own quantum gravity model that he's proposed. There's also the Hartle-Hawking model and numerous others that have been emerging. Once again, we're just missing a lot of nuance on the part of Dillahunty. Now, I'm not a physicist. I don't work in cosmology. But I think Craig has attested to his knowledge of the literature and has spelled out in great detail his views concerning the BGV, and makes no such elementary mistakes that have been attributed to him.
Speaking of that book with Smith and Craig, it's kind of related. Craig and Carol wrote a book recently, didn't they? Have you gotten a chance to read it?
Yeah, it's an edited volume. It's a transcript of their debate, plus other contributors sort of adding, just pretty much supplementing the broader discussion about God and cosmology.
Is it worth it?
It's pretty good. In fact, I was actually just citing it right now to get that citation from Vilenkin. It's just called God and Cosmology.
Yeah. Okay. I just didn't know if you read it or not, but I didn't realize you were actually quoting that too, because I've been meaning to get it. That's all. All right. Anything else, you guys? Aish?
No, I mean, as far as I know, I haven't done super in-depth research into the physics, but there really isn't like a scientific consensus of any sort on the stuff that they're talking about. So I don't see why Craig's claim is necessarily like just defunct. So
Right.
I think they summed it up pretty well.
All right.
Just real quick, I just also think it's just really interesting that, obviously Dillahunty's finding a physicist who agrees with him or is more on his side when there's numerous other physicists who aren't as popular as Carroll who are equally credentialed, who have different thoughts on stuff. So that's all I gotta say.
Carroll's just the kind of go-to for this kind of stuff, it seems. Cool. Let's keep going.
It does not prove the cause of the universe, but the cause of the expansion of the universe. And I think that's simply incorrect. The truth of the two premises, whatever begins to exist has a cause, and the universe began to exist, entails that there is a cause of the universe. So it logically and necessarily follows from the premises that there is a cause of the universe.
So here he's responding to me saying that the second premise, the universe began to exist, is possibly incorrect, and that it may have always existed, and that what we're talking about is merely its expansion. Presenting that hypothetical model as a contradictory hypothesis to the second premise. And his response is seemingly wrong at every turn. He says, I'm claiming that the argument does not prove the cause of the universe, but instead proves the cause of the expansion. No, I'm not. I'm saying that if the universe didn't begin to exist, but merely expanded, then the argument is unsound because the second premise is no longer considered true. When he says,
the truth of the two premises entails that there is a cause of the universe,
he simply ignores the point being made that the second premise may not be true. And by the way, the first might also not be true. So in my objection to saying, hey, there's a problem with the second premise, there may be a different explanation other than the universe began to exist and that it always existed in some form and expanded. How did you rule that out? His response is to just assert that he thinks I'm incorrect and that the truth of the two premises entails that there is a cause of the universe. How much more of a bald-ass assertion can you get? It's like, nuh-uh. I said so in the argument originally. But even if you were able to list the characteristics of the cause of the expansion of the universe, or the cause of the local presentation of the universe, or however you wanted to word it, even if those characteristics were similar to the proposed characteristics of an unproven God, that still doesn't make them identical. Oh, well, it had to be something timeless because time didn't exist before the Big Bang. Okay, well, it doesn't even make sense to talk about before the Big Bang, and maybe that cosmology is not correct, but it has to be timeless. Okay. But really, in that context, all it means is that it's not bound by the time within the local presentation of the universe. It doesn't mean that it's not bound by any time. It doesn't mean that it's not bound by metatime and a metaverse or anything like that. It just means that X is not bound by the time constraints of the local presentation of the universe. But that's obvious and true for anything that would be this change since time began, our local presentation of time began then.
In my work, I have insisted over against naturalists and physicalists that time itself cannot be identified with physical time, the time of our universe. But the arguments that I present against the infinitude of the past show that the temporal series of events must have a beginning, and that therefore the cause of the universe exists changelessly sans creation. And therefore, on a relational view of time, time cannot exist in the absence of events or change. And therefore, I think it is very plausible that the cause of the universe doesn't simply transcend our physical time in this universe, but more metaphysically, that the cause of the universe exists timelessly because it exists changelessly alone.
Okay, cool story. Now go do the actual physics work that moves your proposed view of time out of the realm of armchair philosophy or a former president of the Philosophy of Time Society and into the world where actual physicists specializing in temporal studies agree with you. Again, Craig isn't a physicist and neither am I, but at least I'm not claiming that I've cracked the model. And in the response just before this one, Craig ended by saying the question of why the universe that came into being is expanding rather than, say, contracting or steady state is a question to be answered by physics. Yes, it is. As is all of this speculation about time. It's funny that he recognizes that and then keeps going on about, well, in my study, in my work, this is going to come up several other times. Craig took this a little personally in thinking that if I respond to...
This is a...
I saw you itching.
Yeah, that's what I was telling you in the beginning, man. Like this part right here. Yeah, so so obviously the conversation is about the nature of time. And Dillahunty, he haunts me, bro. Like he wants to he completely ignores the fact that the conversation is about the nature of time and then goes straight to the physics and prioritizes the physics and what the physicists do over what actual philosophers of science does, and like actually downplays Craig's contribution to that literature and to that field. So yeah, there's going to be metric time and there's non-metric time. Either way, what undergirds both of those are understanding it's generally understood in like the philosophy of time literature that time is a kind of change, that when you have change, you have time, right? And if the relational view is correct, which I think it is, then when there's change, you have time. Either that be non-metric or that be metric, either way. Then you still have, that's what time is understood to be. So I think it's unnecessary. It might be even a bit of a red herring to speculate about meta time or something like that. Like, we understand like we're talking about the nature and metaphysics of time here. And so it's very simple. It's that if there was a state of affairs in which there isn't any change, then there is no time. Once there is change, then there is time, and that's all Craig is arguing for. That you would have to have for that state of affairs to actually get going. Then that's what he means by timeless and things of that sort. So it's very, again, he's just ignoring the metaphysics. And,
right. The other thing is I'd be willing to bet that a lot of physicists would be looking to Craig as one of like the leading thinkers when it comes to the subject of time itself right now. I mean, that's pretty much what he's known for, at least in the academic side of things, to my knowledge. And so I don't know if Matt knows that or not, but I think that's a really important thing that isn't taken into account here either.
Yeah, so I may not be adding anything to address Dillahunty's point here, but once again, just to supplement what Tim has just made note of, and it's that and this is something I should have clarified in the short, brief presentation that I had, which is that Craig himself has noted that none of the arguments that he has defended imply that time itself had a beginning, right? Rather, what they entail is that time, which is divisible into distinct intervals, must have had a beginning. And this is what Tim referred to as metric time, though there is a concern about whether or not, if you follow the work of Swinburne, Alan Patchett, and John Lucas in introducing something like a non-metric time. Mark Nowacki also makes note of this in his book on the Kalam. He says that the KCA does not prove that the quantity of past time is finite. Rather, it proves that the quantity of past events is finite.
Yep.
And so this is going to be a concern which will require some supplementation from the physics, though it will surpass that given these additional considerations. So for that reason, I wouldn't hedge my bets against the end of the Kalam on the basis of the physics alone. We're going to need some additional metaphysical arguments in order to do such a thing.
Yeah. All right, you guys ready to keep going?
A version of the Kalam cosmological argument that somehow in his head, I'm trying to debunk everything he's ever said or done, which is not the case. You've used a seemingly obvious and yet still questionable syllogism to determine the universe must have cause. And then you go and put on a smile and say that cause must be God because it sounds a lot like God. Well, why is that cause not a multiverse? Why is it not a physical process that's beyond our current ken? Why is it a mind? And why is it in particular a mind that's absent of physical form with power over everything, which provides no clear evidence of its existence and yet somehow inspires people to different conclusions about reality? It's got to be the most confused.
So if I can add something there really quickly, like I noted earlier, so he does give those arguments, gives an argument against the quiescent universe hypothesis. He gives an argument for why it's personal, and he adopts the Islamic principle of determination, so that you're pretty much offered a disjunction, right? It's either a mechanistic cause or it's an agent cause, right? And then he adduces that it can't be this mechanistic cause. For that reason, it's an agent cause. So he kind of follows Richard Swinburne there. So he also gives like a Swinburnian argument. So once again, because the Kalam is a cosmological argument, it's going to be divided into two stages, right? The first stage is where we just establish minimally that there's at least one necessary being or some kind of a being that meets the criteria that we're talking about earlier, right? It could be a first cause, it could be a necessary being, whatever. But then the second one's going to say that it has to be the sort of thing that is different from everything else, right? And Craig does that. So again, this is just demonstrably false.
Yeah. All right.
thing ever.
Well, then Matt says, well, why is it a mind? Well, in my published work, I present 3 independent arguments for thinking that the cause of the universe is a mind. First, because the only 2 things that could be accurately described as timeless, spaceless, and immaterial are either an unembodied mind or consciousness, or else an abstract object, like a number.
Excuse me? He claims that only 2 things could be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. And those 2 things are, number 1, all abstract objects. Number 2, an unembodied mind or consciousness. Now, first of all, in these responses to the other questions, Craig seems to know a great deal about what's required procedurally in order to begin a universe. I don't know where he got this. It seems rather convenient. But to say that only 2 things could exist that are timeless, spaceless, and immaterial, abstract objects and an unembodied mind, please show your work, Dr. Craig. I'm not aware of any evidence for an unembodied mind or consciousness. I'm aware of lots of claims about an unembodied mind or consciousness, and I'm aware that you and others are claiming this is one of the only possible answers, that there's an unembodied mind, but I'm not aware of any evidence for that proposition at all, let alone that it's one of the only 2 things that can exist. This is what Craig and others do with the Kalam, is they present a formal structured argument and then smuggle in all of the God stuff with bald-ass assertions like this. Well, we know that the only thing could be timeless, spaceless is either an abstract object, which can't do anything, or it's an unembodied mind, which sounds a lot like God, which is precisely what I accuse them of doing in the clip he's responding to. This is becoming a trend. Every time I say something, Craig comes in and demonstrates that I was right while lamenting the fact that I'm not familiar enough with his work as if this video was about him.
It's gratifying, Bill, because apparently people are calling in and using the Kalam, discussing the Kalam with him. They'll call into the...
Okay, so I know we stopped earlier, but I feel like that should be dealt with right there.
It should.
I don't even know where to start. Because he's just calling this just an assertion, but if we're putting up a hypothesis to explain the data that we're trying to, the relevant data, right? If we're having this candidate hypothesis of an immaterial mind or an unembodied mind to explain everything, the evidence for that hypothesis is the data that it would predict, which is the data that we're trying to explain, right? So, am I missing something here, or
No, it's really weird because, again, I think this is the 3rd time I can count in this video that he's just dismissed metaphysics as an actual valid area of inquiry. That these are the 2 metaphysical options on the table. What's interesting is Craig says timeless, spaceless, and immaterial, and I think that Dillahunty left off the immaterial portion when he was critiquing this. I don't know if that was correct or not, but I didn't hear him really say immaterial. But I mean, Dillahunty's welcome to present a 3rd candidate that's immaterial, timeless, and spaceless. That's not a abstract object or
an unembodied mind,
or just pure consciousness. I mean, he's welcome to do that, but he's acting as though Craig has some ulterior motive for limiting the options down to 2. I find it really funny when he says abstract objects can't do anything. I like that's the way he tried to simplify it. That's a funny way to put it. It actually makes me laugh. Abstract objects can't do anything. Causally speaking or ontologically speaking. But anyway, it's I mean, that's not really a response he really gave. He just didn't like the fact that he brought it down to 2, and he thinks that it's I think he thinks metaphysical theorizing is just like asserting things. It's really weird.
Right. And I'll just kind of keep it at that, I guess. Guarded, you got something?
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Tim said about the ulterior motives. As I noted earlier, so Craig follows Swinburne, and maybe I shouldn't say follows him, but he at least is in agreement with Swinburne that the only 2 candidate causes here would be an impersonal cause or a personal cause. And so, again, you can dispute that, but there are reasons which are given on behalf of this particular disjunction. Apart from that, though, once again, there are motivations, but again, you're not going to see all of these being spelled out in many of Craig's popular presentations for the reason that they are popular presentations.
Yeah.
It's worth noting that there is a lot more metaphysical baggage that actually lies beneath the Kalam. In fact, if you read, I forget his name. I believe I think it was just John something. He wrote a critical article on the Kalam, called A Swift Argument for God, or something like that, in religious studies. And a lot of critics of the Kalam have wondered, is this too swift an argument? It seems too easy, right? You get these two premises, you get this conclusion, then you add a pretty simple sub argument for why it's personal and why it's a divine cause, and it seems way too quick. But Craig and others, Oppie comes to mind as well, have noted that it is not by any means a swift argument.
Yeah.
Once again, the metaphysical baggage which comes in to defend each one of the premises far
And that
exceeds the
conceptual
popular
analysis.
presentation. Yeah.
It's
I think it's
Go
like
ahead.
just interesting because like I'm not entirely sure what he's trying to do, because like if he's trying to claim that you cannot use the KCA, like it's not possible to use the KCA for theism, then I don't understand how he is just saying that, okay, well, it's just this stage that he's addressing, and not recognizing the fact that there are further arguments to support it. So I don't fully understand his methodology in attacking the argument, because I don't think that it's genuine in any way, shape, or form. But
So what do you guys? I mean that is an interesting question. What do you guys think? Do you think that his main problem is that God just isn't mentioned in the premises, or like you said, Than, that it's not a 48 premise argument with explicit premises about stage 2 and stuff? Or do you like?
So I'm not going to sit here and psychologize, right? I don't have access to what's going on inside of Matt's head, but it to me it seems like what's going on here is that he just wants to defeat theism rather than like right, rather than like engaging into like the rigorous parts of the Kalam cosmological argument. Like the Kalam's not my favorite argument out there, right? But to treat it like it's this simple two premise argument, and there's no, like Guarded said, right, like there's just no metaphysical baggage that comes along with it, and these intense conversations that have to come by. I just either think it's disingenuous or misinformed. So anybody else?
What was it that you asked again? Like, what was it that you asked him?
I asked if do we think that Dillahunty's main problem is just that God isn't mentioned in the premises, or that we need more premises, or?
Well, I wouldn't blame him or other individuals for thinking that the Kalam is the first stage of the Kalam is really all you get with the argument. If all they have been all that they've been familiar with are the popular presentations, or maybe some other presentations that assume that there's some knowledge of the background material. Because most people, when you hear the Kalam, what are they going to say? Yeah, I know the Kalam. It's a 3-premise argument, and they'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
However, though, if he really does have an interest, a vested interest in addressing the Kalam, right, he's going to have to go. He's going to have to go further and investigate the preceding literature. I mean, the countless amounts of papers and books that we can mention, and I'm not saying he has to read all of them. I'm just saying, though, that he should be able to give a fair assessment and should understand that it follows the general schema of every cosmological argument. Right. It's a two-stage. Yeah. It's a two-stage cosmological argument. I can't stress it enough.
Also, like, just to add on, but like, this is not something that's uncommon in apologetics in general, to use, like a series of arguments to establish one conclusion. Like that's pretty much the way that classical apologetics is traditionally approached. So, I mean, I would assume that he's like familiar with this. So I'm very surprised that he's just ignoring that and treating it as if it's like an isolated just argument that's, meant to magically prove every single thing in like 3 premises. Like,
right.
Mm-hmm. I was going to add something. Excuse me. I was going to add something, which is that cosmological arguments historically, right? If you look at the traditional ones, they have all had some sort of a deficiency with respect to their stage 2 components, right? I mean, taking Aquinas's 5 ways, for example, right? A lot of people have a reason to be skeptical to affirm the conclusion that therefore God exists, because the preceding premise is that, for instance, he will conclude that there's an unmoved mover, and he will add that this is what most people call God. And obviously there are concerns for these stage 2s, right? How is it that you can connect a stage 1 to stage 2, and that is a genuine concern. But I don't see any criticisms for the inference, rather the connection between the stage 1 and stage 2. Rather, I'm just seeing that he's neglecting to recognize that there even is a stage 2 to begin with.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, he can, if he wants to deny the stage 2 of the second stage of the Kalam, then by all means go ahead and offer arguments. That has been further developed by others apart from Craig, other than Craig. For instance, that whole debate that Cameron had with Rationality Rules with Stephen Woodford, they introduced some novel arguments in support of the second stage. So he can, if he has qualms with that, then by all means he can address that. But he shouldn't act as if the second stage doesn't exist. It most certainly does.
Right. I mean, if to be fair, I'm not a big fan of like Frank Turek's presentations. Right, but even when he presents the Kalam, like he uses inferences to get to that spaceless, timeless, immaterial, right? Personal powerful agent, like that is still technically even a stage 2. So to act like we just even the use of inference isn't allowed to make some sort of a probability assessment, right? It's just weird to me, I guess. You guys ready to keep going?
Yeah,
Unless,
and maybe we can even add, even if it didn't have a stage 2, grant that, even if it didn't have it, there's no reason why no one could use it as a part of a broader case for theism and demonstrating
exactly.
that it offers at least some evidence, no matter how low, it offers at least some evidence in favor of the worldview. So once again, it's like, if he has issues with the Kalam, then you can mention those, but don't caricature it. It has a second stage, and even if it didn't, you could still use it as evidence for theism.
Exactly.
The television show, but Matt and his co-host, they're kind of on the hot seat there. They have to defend naturalism, atheism, and all this. But people are calling in and saying it must be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. And so he's hearing that. But then he says his complaint seems to be, but you're getting outside of the syllogism when you get to this other stuff. You're adding stuff.
It's very clear that he's never read my published work, in which I argue at length for each of these attributes that I ascribe to the first cause.
Gosh, once again, it's all about Craig. And even after his co-host correctly points out that I'm responding to other people who call the shows, it's, he's clear he's never read my published work. Well, I have actually read some of Craig's work. I'm more interested in what physicists say about physics than about what Craig says about physics, because Craig has doctorates in philosophy and theology. He's a bright man. I'm not claiming he's a dullard, but he's not a physicist. And when the physicists whose model you're citing in support of your view claim that they disagree with you, I think I'll side more with them until you've done the lab work instead of just speculating. He cites the Borg-Guth-Vilenkin model, and both Guth and Vilenkin have pointed out that they disagree with his understanding of what does and doesn't qualify as a possibility for a multiverse. And I believe there's a debate, I haven't finished watching it, someone referred me to it, between Alan Guth and Sir Roger Penrose about whether there's a multiverse or a cyclic universe. And despite, I hate to say this because I'm getting this secondhand, but I'm under the understanding that Craig has claimed that both Guth and Penrose agreed with him on this, when seemingly in this debate they both publicly disagree with him.
It proves that the expanding era of inflation that we're part of must have a past boundary someplace. That does not necessarily mean the universe had a beginning.
And then you and I, we talked about this great video out there, which is a whole bunch of physicists talking about the Kalam cosmological argument and what they get wrong.
Right. It's called Physics and Philosophers Reply to the Kalam Cosmological Argument, and I'll link to it in the description. It's new, and if you haven't seen it yet, it's definitely a must-watch for anyone interested in these kind of arguments.
Al-Ghazali's argument was pretty good, given the assumptions he was making. It's just that I don't think we now have any reason to accept those assumptions.
So everyday experience furnishes all kinds of generalizations that are inconsistent with the conclusion of the Kalam argument. And it's just arbitrary to choose the generalizations that you like from everyday experience and ignore the ones that don't fit with your conclusion.
All I've said in this video is that this argument, which doesn't include God in its premises or the conclusion, isn't an argument for the existence of God, but is being used to smuggle in arguments for the existence of God. That's it. That's the point. And that's exactly what Craig's doing in response to everything I've said. And I think it's telling
Okay, so I just heard something that I think is really telling. He just said that we're smuggling in, we're using the Kalam to argue, we're using the Kalam to smuggle in other arguments for the existence of God. In other
No.
words, we're using the Kalam to set up a stage 2 for right?
Yeah.
Does he just not
These
understand the function
separate
of the
arguments.
argument?
These separate arguments really just are the second stage of the Kalam.
Exactly.
It's not smuggling.
Well, even alongside the second stage, the support of the first two premises themselves are other arguments.
Yeah.
So the way in which he's supporting every premise is through other arguments. And I think he did it a fourth time. I counted it a fourth time. He whenever metaphysics comes up, he calls it either speculating or just like opinion. Like he did it again. And so I think Matt has a real big problem with metaphysics, which is really going to be I mean, if that's, I mean, he's already determining the route he's going to end up in. If that's the case, it's very convenient for Matt to not want to take the metaphysics seriously, because then he doesn't even have to grapple with any stage 2 considerations. He can just kind of swipe it away and call it smuggling or something like that, or speculations.
It's also worth.
Yeah.
Oh, go on.
Oh, I was gonna say, like, the Kalam, like I think the least interesting part of the Kalam is the science. I think that the philosophical arguments for the finitude of the past is where the strongest where the strongest like argumentative heavy lifting is going to be done. Guth is right. It doesn't necessarily show that the universe had an absolute beginning. It doesn't, right? We can be fine with that and think that most likely it does have a beginning. Doesn't necessarily entail it, but most likely it will have a beginning, right? This is what Lawrence Krauss said. He said most likely it does. It's in terms of likelihood, right? But I mean, I think this is what I see a lot on YouTube atheism stuff, is that when they go after the Kalam, they rarely do any treatment on the philosophical arguments for the finitude of the past, either that be causal finitism, Locke's arguments, or Craig's arguments. So I think that just focusing on the physics only is it's not doing it justice.
So, I mean, this might even sound controversial to a lot of people, but if like part of the philosophical argumentations for the finitude of the past are a finite chain of causal events, which is again what the Kalam's really going for here, right? If we derive a logical contradiction from an infinite chain of causal events, that means that it's logically impossible. No amount of physics will be overturning that. And that's where I think, again, just kind of supplementing on what you said, Tim, like that's why I think the philosophical side of this conversation kind of does trump the physics. But
yeah, I think this is what Locke was saying in his book God and Ultimate Origins, when he said that that our metaphysics can inform what we think about the natural world and things of that sort. You know, like it's logically possible, broadly logically possible, that there could be something read and not extended, but it's metaphysically impossible for something to be read, and it's metaphysically impossible for something to be read but not extended, right? We can do those kinds of things, what we garner and what we understand in science, what we understand in metaphysics, can have a very complementary relationship. I think that there are certain things that we can know in metaphysics that that are going to be more certain than what we can know in science. I think J.P. Moreland says, like, there will never be a scientific discovery that will tell me that torturing babies for fun is right.
Yeah.
So it's just the same thing when it comes to some of these other arguments that, and it's like, yeah, there we go. Exactly.
I'm poor, so I just have the digital copy.
Yeah, I have both. And I think like a big problem here is like when Josh Rasmussen talks about like people using arguments as weapons. Like, why can't we just like come to the table here and just think about it philosophically? Like, I love what Rob Kuhn said to Joe Schmidt. He said, hey, listen, if causal finitism is true, like, then that's going to open up some great areas in philosophy to think about. But if it's not true, then like, okay, like it may not, like causal finitism may not well be true. But if it is true, then everyone should be kind of happy and glad that we discovered something, right? Like, I don't know why we can't just think about it like that.
Yeah. Guarded, you got anything?
No, I don't think I have anything else to contribute, but maybe I should just add one little point, which was again just to add on, piggyback on what Tim said about metaphysics informing us about what's possible and whatnot, like it actually endowing us with some kind of knowledge. So Locke does have something that always stuck out to me, like an example that kind of demonstrates this point that metaphysics is in fact like informative. He gives like he offers an equation that has two solutions, right? One solution is 2 and the other one's like -2. But if you were to ask, if you were, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with what I'm talking about here, Tim. But the solution, I forget what it was, but if we were to ask, whether or not two people could carry a computer over to their home, or -2 people, right? Even though -2 was is a solution to the formula, right? If we were to try to put the how would you put it, like to apply the formula to a real world scenario, you would never go with -2, right? I would just recommend that people look at that too.
Yeah. All right, let's keep going.
Dr. Craig chose to respond to my end of the Kalam video instead of addressing this massive video that's out with countless experts pointing out how he's wrong about the physics.
Actually, to his credit, since we last spoke about this, Dr. Craig has started responding to the Physics and Philosophers video.
Yes, when I first heard of this video with this stellar lineup of physicists and philosophers, I was very impressed. I mean, it looked like William Lane Craig against the world.
That's great. It gets him closer to doing the legwork that I suggested and the lab work that I suggested he do. But if all he's going to do is say, I think these physicists are wrong and here's why, without any lab work or science behind him, if he's going to try to come at the physicists with philosophy, he has dramatically misunderstood the power of philosophy. And this is coming from a philosophy geek like me. I love it. But you're not going to take down physicists by saying, I don't have any degree in this. I haven't actually done any lab work on this. Here, let me tell you why philosophically I think your models are not correct. I don't think that's going to go anywhere.
And I think one of the attractive features of the argument is its modesty. It doesn't try to prove any of the moral properties of the first cause of the universe.
Why would I spend time reading the work of someone who thinks that a particular argument is attractive because of what it doesn't cover? What kind of philosophy is this? Is the structure of the argument valid? Are the premises accepted? Those are the questions one asks when evaluating arguments. Validity and soundness, not attractiveness. Not, this one is appealing because we didn't try to throw morality into it as well. Bah, bah, bah. This is the language of propaganda. If you're picking arguments because they're attractive, maybe you, Dr. Craig, are the popularizer.
It doesn't try to prove that this cause is morally good, for example. And in that sense, it doesn't prove the existence of God, if we think of God's goodness as an essential property of God. But it does give us this first uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe, which I think no atheist would be willing to affirm.
I'm sorry, didn't I just say a little while ago that in addition to the Kalam argument, they'll go on and say it does give us a first uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful personal creator? Isn't he literally doing what I've accused him and others of doing? At no point, sir, does the Kalam cosmological argument demonstrate that the cause is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, powerful, personal at all. And whether or not an atheist would be willing to affirm it is yet another red herring that you're throwing in. It is maddening. And it makes me strongly question the honesty of people. When my objection is this argument doesn't do A, B, and C, and you say, I agree, I've been saying that for years, and that's why I have all this other written work. And then in summary about how attractive the argument is, your view is that it's attractive because it didn't throw in this moral stuff, but it does give us a first uncaused, timeless, spaceless, bull. How can you sit there and out of one side of your mouth say, the argument doesn't do this, and out of the other side of your mouth, go right back to saying it does? It's embarrassing for this sort of response to be so absolutely affirming of what my objection was. The Kalam cosmological argument is deader than a dead thing when it comes to demonstrating that a God exists. But it's very, very, very much alive in convincing apologists and people who already believe that they're on really firm footing because it just seems so intuitive. Of course, the universe must have had an explanation. Something can't come from nothing. You hear these things all the time, and they're asserted and they're accepted, and yet there's no demonstration that they're actually correct and that they necessarily lead to a God. So I'm pretty much done with the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, if somebody calls into the show and presents it, I'll give some shortened version of this. as I've been doing a little bit, but there were people who were confused as to how can you dismiss something that's so prevalent? I mean, William Lane Craig, of all people, this is like his favorite argument. Yes, it is, because then it looks like he's accomplished something when he's accomplished absolutely nothing.
Well, in this clip, I take it that Matt's main complaint is that this argument only convinces apologists. And by calling its proponents apologists rather than philosophers, what Matt is doing is attempting to dismiss these people in a very condescending way. And I think our listeners probably can recognize that this is nothing but bluster on his part. The fact is that this argument and its premises are defended today by a constellation of very prominent philosophers and physicists. Let me just read to you from the Cambridge Companion to Atheism, published by Cambridge University Press. This is a book on atheism. In the chapter...
Okay, can we pause it real quick? So...
There's so many things we can hit on. Go ahead.
Why is he being like this? Like that. I'm just gonna put that out there. Like I just don't understand the need. So Craig
calling it propaganda,
calling it propaganda, and so Craig can feel good and warm inside that he accomplished something.
I mean, let's talk about something like, okay, so we can table that for just a second.
Okay, sure.
Let's just talk about the fact that he previously calls himself a philosophy nerd, but then doesn't understand why an argument that's more modest is more attractive and why we should be trying to make more modest arguments. I like the reason why we should be liking the Kalam is because the conclusion of that second stage is more modest compared to other arguments that we can make for theism. Yeah. And so that makes it makes it easier to come to a probability that theism is true because it's less intensive. Like,
yeah, there are less moving parts. There are less chances for things to go wrong.
Exactly.
Less claims to make, less commitments to have.
There's less battles to have.
Yeah.
Right. I was just kind of dumbfounded when we didn't understand that point. I guess I don't know. Guarded, you got anything?
I think all I can really say is just share Tim's sort of surprise here and confusion. I'm not quite sure what I'm listening to. I thought most of what he said in the first 10 to 15 minutes was worth addressing, though I'm not sure if we're going to be finding any
anything else really here.
Inferences after that.
Yeah. So I think Craig kind of hit it on the point here. Like he's calling this propaganda, and then he's using the word apologist as a slur word. And I'm just, I guess at this point, I'm just going to call this part what it is. And I'm just going to call it kind of empty rhetoric.
Yeah.
I think we can move on from there unless anybody else has anything else to say. Okay.
Written by Quentin Smith. This is what Smith has to say. He writes, account of the articles in the philosophy journals shows that more articles have been published about Craig's defense of the Kalam argument than have been published about any other philosopher's contemporary formulation of an argument for God's existence. Surprisingly, this even holds for Plantinga's arguments for the rational acceptability of the ontological argument and Plantinga's argument that theism is a rationally acceptable basic belief. The fact that atheists and theists alike cannot leave Craig's Kalam argument alone suggests that it may be an argument of unusual philosophical interest or else has an attractive core of plausibility that keeps philosophers turning back to it and examining it once again.
Here, let me tell you once again how important I am and how important my work is. Even atheists recognize it. Let me show you how popular my argument is. Atheists, they just can't keep it alone. Why, Bill Craig, you old popularizer, you. Wrong. I don't have to keep coming back to the Kalam cosmological argument because it has some robustness. It's the theist contacting me to parrot what they've heard and couldn't rebut that I have to address. I haven't spent any time on reevaluating the Kalam from the moment I discovered that it doesn't address God at all and that everything else is in some secondary argument. I just have to keep explaining the problems with this argument. Problems Craig seems to agree with on one hand and disagree with on the other, depending on which sentence he's uttering. The argument doesn't present any properties of the cause, but he keeps claiming it does. Even in his response to me complaining that they keep adding properties to this, he does it again. We recognize it's a popular argument. Probably because you've picked an appealing argument instead of one that can be clearly shown to be true. I've never claimed the cosmological argument. I've never claimed the Kalam cosmological argument didn't have an appeal. In fact, they quoted me saying directly, that the Kalam cosmological argument is deader than a dead thing when it comes to demonstrating that a God exists, but it's very, very, very much alive in convincing apologists and people who already believe that they're on really firm footing because it just seems so intuitive. Craig responds to this by suggesting that I'm just dismissing everybody as if apologists rather than saying it convinces philosophers. Well, I don't care if it convinces philosophers or apologists or people who don't have any understanding of the subject or people who've been studying it for years. What I care about is it demonstrably true? And I'm not convinced that the argument is sound, but even if it were, it's not an argument for the existence of God. Maybe instead of saying, oh, I've used it and it has convinced people, because I'm not asserting that it hasn't convinced anybody, maybe you could spend some time doing the legwork to show that all of the secondary arguments that you use to support your actual conclusion are more important than the Kalam, because the Kalam begins with and ends with, therefore the universe had a cause. Well, for most people, that seems intuitive. For most people, they're like, well, of course there had to be some cause to the universe. What kind of cause could it be? And then you spend all your time telling them what it must be on subjects that they don't understand, on subjects that you, by the way, don't have a degree in. If you're not going to debate me because I don't have a terminal degree, why should any physicist ever debate you? But they do. Why do they keep doing it? Why is it that Craig's defense of the Kalam has been published about more than any other philosopher's contemporary argument formulation for the existence of God? Because it's one of the most popular. It doesn't have anything to do with whether or not you've actually demonstrated God or stumped people. We can keep talking about it over and over again as why is this argument, which should be dead, still appealing? Which, by the way, is almost verbatim of what I said. My big frustration here, and it's simple, is people keep asking me, hey, will you debate William Lane Craig? Sure. When I go to seek debates, I largely don't care who the person is, unless the person is just absolutely terrible. And then, there are some people I've refused to debate because I don't want to be on a share stage with them. But by and large, when I'm preparing for debate, I'm preparing for the topic, not the person. So I don't care that much if Craig ever debates me or not. I've already talked about problems with Kalam, and I've already talked about, some of his standard shtick. I didn't make this video as a response to William Lane Craig. I made this video because there are countless people who Craig and others have reached who keep calling into the various shows about subjects they don't understand, thinking that, aha, atheists, everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause for existence, and that cause must be timeless, spaceless, blah, blah, blah. And that sounds an awful lot like God. Well, does it really sound an awful lot like God? I'm not aware of a God. I'm not aware of what properties a God has. You've just asserted there exists agent A with properties P, and those...
Okay, there is something I need to say here.
Press X to doubt.
Like, why are you complaining about people calling into your show and giving an argument for theism when that's like the whole purpose of your call-in show?
Yeah, this is kind of getting off the rails. I feel a little bit.
Yeah,
what he's doing right
so
here.
at this point, like, you guys watched this video before this. Is
Yeah.
there anything else that's like even worth going into at this point?
No, there's only about like 2 or 3 minutes left.
Yeah. So
about the same.
At the end of the day, like the biggest critiques that is actually levied here are God isn't in the premises, and he's talking about how like theists will smuggle in other arguments for God after, but those are really just called stage 2 arguments.
Right.
We talked about how he's just completely dismissed metaphysics, and talks about the physics and all that other stuff. We addressed that. Like, is there anything else we really need to address here?
No.
He doesn't think that Craig is qualified to talk about these topics, which is really interesting. He thinks that the Kalam, from what I take, the implication here is that if Craig isn't qualified to talk about these topics, it's because Craig isn't a theoretical physicist.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, I think it plausibly means that Dillahunty thinks that this issue is purely a question of the physics, which is just an elementary misunderstanding of all of the literature ever done on the Kalam.
Yeah.
Before there was any physics to be understood, as we understand in modern physics, these arguments were being made. Now they think that that's evidence against it, and stuff, but it's actually not. This is more sophisticated, rigorous, and helpful amendments are being done in this argument. I mean, I don't even think Craig's argument is the strongest Kalam that's out there. I personally would never use his Kalam if I was going to defend it.
Yeah.
But the Kalam as a family is still alive and well, not because it's got some subjective personal appeal, but because it is. I love what Real Atheology always says, that it's a great way to dive into deeper philosophical, diverse fields, and that's a virtue of it, right? It's this whole idea of I mean, these aren't weapons that are being used here. But I think Dillahunty is just very obsessed with the idea that an apologist is someone who isn't actually into learning what's true, but just wants to convince the masses of people of their already pre-existing beliefs. So I think that's a big problem that's running in the background here, and I think that that's really apparent in a lot of Dillahunty's issues that he's taking up with Craig.
Yeah. Guard,
Yeah.
you got anything else to say?
Yeah, I think I may be sounding a bit redundant, but as we noted earlier, once you sort of lay out the land, and I think you will quickly discover that the Kalam is much more as meets the eye, or that meets the eye rather, because once again, a lot of philosophical work does have to be done in order to establish the first stage. Precisely because if it fails, then there's no use in introducing the second stage. The argument will collapse. So that this is the reason why the first stage is given such precedence, and it's become so prominent. It's what Craig and others have the most interest in first establishing. But I think all I can really say is there's just elementary misunderstandings on the part of Dillahunty concerning the nature of the Kalam and its scope. The Kalam is most certainly an argument for theism, and does certainly end with the conclusion that God exists. Whether one finds that inference, that connection between the stage 1 and stage 2 justified, is obviously open for discussion and open for debate. We see that in the work of Morriston, Malpass, Schmidt, and whatnot. So it certainly is a blossoming point of discussion, but it seems as if Dillahunty's not interested in being a part of that.
Correct. Yeah. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining me as we dove into that. I really appreciate you guys coming. I had to leave early, which is unfortunate, but that's okay. Again, I'll I'll plug all you guys' like social media links into the description of the video. And yeah, thanks again for coming in and joining me. Thank you everybody for listening. Until next time.
Thank you.